Okay, and we are live. First thing, I'm going to make you the host so we can move forward. All right, and I believe you are the host now.
Oh, yes, it says so.
All right. Okay, its practitioners call themselves al-Istiqama, the people of straightness, but more commonly known to outsiders as Ibadis, are the third branch within the Islamic sectarian tripartite. Ibadis are a numerically smaller sect in comparison to their Sunni and Shi'a counterparts, and out of approximately 50 Muslim majority countries, there is only one country in which Ibadis constitute the majority. Not much is known about them within the Muslim community, let alone outside of the Muslim community, but within academia, the story has been slightly different, where the study of Ibadi Islam is the game of a happy few, thus making its scholarship far and few between, which is why I'm thankful to have the eminent scholar of Ibadi Islam, Professor Valerie J. Hoffman, with me today to discuss the topic. Dr. Hoffman, Professor Hoffman, if you don't mind, can you please introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. So my name is Valerie Hoffman. I, until recently, was a professor of Islamic studies in the Department of Religion at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I just retired this year after teaching there for many, many years. Actually, my background is my PhD and my master's were both from the University of Chicago in Arabic and Islamic studies, but my bachelor's was in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. And so some of my work has combined an interest in Arabic texts with more anthropological type field work. So that is, I guess, enough of a background on me. I've done research in a number of different areas. I mean, that is somewhat unusual. I think most people sort of stick with one area more or less, but in graduate school, I focused on Islamic theology and philosophy, but I did my doctoral dissertation on Muslim women's religious lives in contemporary Egypt. And then my next big research project was on Sufism in modern Egypt, and I wrote a book on that subject as well. And it was only after that that I got into Ibadi studies. So this is a field I entered mid-career as a tenured professor already. So.
Okay, that was a really good summary on what led you in that direction towards Ibadi studies from studying anthropology. I do have a question from a friend of mine who wanted to know, because he found out that you had studied at the University of Chicago. Were you acquainted with Fazlur Rahman?
Yes, he was my major advisor. So indeed, I studied with Fazlur Rahman, and he really hoped I would do my doctoral dissertation comparing al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd on the creation of the world, but nonetheless, he was supportive of the direction I went. I should say, though, that, I really haven't explained what got me into Ibadism, because it was a kind of roundabout way. After I published my book on Sufism in modern Egypt, I thought, well, I've done two big projects on Egypt, and I wanted to do something very different, because I was afraid if I wanted to do something outside Egypt, even though Egypt is great and wonderful, because it isn't the entire Muslim world, although Egyptians tend to think it is sometimes. But because Egypt has such a leading role in the modern Arab world, in terms of that most of the modern ideologies began in Egypt, whether we talk about Islamic modernism or Islamic fundamentalism, if you want to use that term, or Arabism, they also began in Egypt, in the Arab world, and then proceeded to other countries. So began to be interested in the possibility of studying Islam in East Africa, because most of the works that had been written on Islam in East Africa were written from a social sciences perspective. So I thought someone with my kind of background maybe could approach it differently. And
just before ahead, because that is something I was definitely going to ask you about your time in East Africa, just so we don't jump ahead of any of the questions, which I really don't mind if it happens to. But I definitely wanted to know, you started studying Arabic during your sophomore year at the University of Pennsylvania, knowing very little, if anything, about Islam, the Middle East, or Arabs. So what inspired you to start learning Arabic, the Arabic language? That's what I wanted to.
Sure. Yeah. I was always interested in other cultures and languages, and I enjoyed languages. I had studied French and German and wanted to do something very different. And at that time, I was thinking I might go into the field of archaeology of the ancient Middle East. So I thought Penn actually did teach these ancient languages, and I considered studying an ancient language like that, and was told that was really kind of a doctoral student's field. So I thought, okay, I'll study Arabic then. That way, if I'm ever digging in Egypt or Iraq, I can talk with local people. And because when I was a little girl, I had read the World Atlas, including language maps, and knew that Arabic covered a huge stretch of the world. So that was why I started studying Arabic. And then because I chose then to do my junior year at the University of Tunis in Tunisia, North Africa, I became interested in the impact of Islam on the culture, and that led me into just a more innate interest in Islamic thought, which is why I focused on Islamic theology and philosophy in grad school. And I wrote my master's thesis actually on sort of the development of the Islamic theology on the unity of God. So, the essence and attributes and all of that, all of which ended up being very handy once I got into Ibadi studies, that I'd had that kind of background.
Okay. So you were able to use your notes from your dissertation to help you with your later work on Ibadism. That's very interesting. And it seems like for a lot of people, Arabic is the key towards Islamic studies. So how did your interest in Islamic studies and the study of Muslim societies develop? Was it right when you entered the Arabic language program, like you became fascinated with Islamic studies and Muslim societies, or did it develop as, from what I've researched, you spent quite a bit of time in North Africa, the Middle East, Egypt, East Africa. Did it develop during that time you were traveling around those places, or did it just just to sum up my question, did it just hit you and stick with you right away?
Well, I think it developed when I was a student in Tunis, and then after I graduated from Penn, I had a year in Egypt as on an advanced Arabic language program, a total immersion program. But I think studying Arabic right from the first year, because my professor took a very classical approach, we were given texts of the Quran to read, which is unusual, I mean, for American Arabic programs, and texts of early Islamic histories. And I realized how little I knew, and I just simply wanted to learn more. So yeah, but by the time I graduated from college, I thought long and hard about it. Do I want to continue in anthropology, or do I want to go specifically into Islamic studies? And found that I wanted specifically Islamic studies. I wanted to learn about that. And of course, when I went to graduate school, it was like whole new horizons opening to me. I had known so little about the history of Islamic civilization. It was totally fascinating to me, enthralling, really. So I was in it.
And I'm sure your background in anthropology definitely helped contribute to your study in Islamic study, or your research in Islamic studies. So back on your time in East Africa, looking at a lot of the articles you have written, tend to focus on East Africa, specifically Zanzibar, more in the modern period. Seemed like around the 18th, 19th, 20th century period.
Well, especially the 19th and 20th century, really, not, you know, it was only in the 19th century that Zanzibar became an important center of Islamic learning. And, you know, I first went to Zanzibar for a summer in 1998, and then again in 1999. And when I was there in 1998, I was going for two reasons. One, to get better at Swahili, and the other to see what kinds of new avenues for research there would be. And it was there in Zanzibar that I first came across Ibadi manuscripts. Not knowing they were Ibadi, I just came across texts that kept referring to thinkers who were clearly important that I had never heard of. And to be honest, I had a moment of panic. I thought, I'm a tenured professor in Islamic thought. I ought to know all the major thinkers. And then I realized, it suddenly occurred to me, these could be Ibadi texts, because the Swahili coast had been colonized by Oman, ruled by Oman. And Oman is, the Sultanate of Oman is the one country, as you mentioned, that has, in which the majority of Muslims may be Ibadi. There's some discussion about percentages, but regardless, historically speaking, they have been dominant. And so it was true that they were Ibadi texts. And although I knew about something a little bit, teensy bit, about the, you know, where Ibadism stood in early history, I knew nothing about its thought. And when I was going around trying to find sources that could give me a quick education on, okay, what's distinctive about Ibadism? What do they think? I found it very difficult. But yes, I've had a special interest on Ibadism in the modern period, the 19th and 20th centuries in particular. And Zanzibar is a fascinating place to study, actually, as a new capital that sort of emerged in the 19th century.
I'm curious, how was the environment? Because, you know, my wife has been pushing me, if we ever go on vacation, she would like to visit Zanzibar. So I wonder if it's because, like, it must be like really beautiful, looking at its location.
It is very beautiful. I mean, it's, you know, like in so many places, there's a great deal of poverty, but at the same time, there's also wealth and a great deal of history. I am actually not really up on the restoration of Stone Town or whatever, Stone Town being the central part of Zanzibar town, which had been the place where Arabs and Indians and people who were sort of upper class lived in the 19th century and 20th century. But a lot of it has molded and is kind of dilapidated, but there's also been an interest on the part of scholars and the government to restore certain things. So there are restoration projects. That isn't something I've really kept up on. And the last time I was in Zanzibar was back in 2003, I think. So quite a while ago now, but yeah, it's a great place. And when I was looking about where might I go to study Islam in East Africa, I consulted with a scholar because I would be traveling with 3 young children and didn't want to go to a dangerous place. And so I had been considering Lamu in Kenya, the Lamu Island, which I had been to before, and it's a fascinating place. But actually, because of the war in Somalia, which had spilled over into northern Kenya, I was advised against going there. So I ended up going to Zanzibar was recommended, and it was a wonderful choice. So yes, it's a great place to go to.
Okay, and on to the Ibadis. So who are the Ibadis? And from what point in Islamic/Muslim history, because some people wrestle with what you should call it, what point in Islamic Muslim history do they see their origins? I believe I read from you saying that their beginnings actually take shape starting with the assassination of the third Caliph Uthman, though I was under the impression that their origins lie in the Battle of Siffin. Of course, not under the name of Ibadism, but as where they originate.
Well, I think that, yes, most Ibadis would trace their origins to the Battle of Siffin, and that is fair. And I do have a PowerPoint just to help. So I'm going to share that if that's okay. And let's see how it, well, wait a sec. Let me not do it that way. Let's do it this way instead. How strange. Okay. So you can see that, right?
No, not yet.
Oh, really? Okay, let me try something. Oh, I guess I didn't click share.
Oh, there we go.
All right, so now you can see it, yes? Okay, good. So, as you yourself said, the Ibadis, they're actually a very small sect. I mean, they're less than 1% of the world's Muslims. So they're a very small sect of Islam that is not Sunni or Shiite. And they've often been called moderate Khawarij or moderate Kharijites, but they don't like to be called Khawarij. So for those who are unfamiliar with who the Khawarij are those who separate themselves from the army of the fourth Caliph of Islam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, at the Battle of Siffin. And when Ali agreed to the proposal of his opponent, Muawiyah ibn Sufyan, to subject their disagreement to arbitration, there were those who opposed this and abandoned him for that reason. And they called themselves Muhakkima for their slogan, judgment belongs to God alone. So the Ibadis definitely trace their origins to the Muhakkima. I think from the vantage point of scholars of Islam in an academic sense, you'd have to say that the Muhakkima represented, however, a strand that was evident from the time of the mutiny against Hoffman, which led to his assassination, because they were based on an idea that that piety needed to be reflected in correct observance of the law, right, in good deeds, and that major sins undercut a person's faith. So the Khawarij in general felt that grave sin without repentance nullifies faith. And since this is the justification for the assassination of Uthman, you'd have to say that the Muhakkima were those who really felt that the assassination of Uthman was justified, that to subject, and what was the basis of the disagreement between Ali and Muawiyah? Muawiyah, as a cousin of Uthman, was seeking revenge for the killing of Uthman, whereas Ali's army had a diverse group of people, but they included those who felt strongly that the assassination of Uthman was totally justified because he'd become an unjust ruler who must be overthrown if he refused to repent or resign. So therefore, that is why one, where do you trace your origins, whatever. One thing I do want to say is that even though the Ibadis do not like to be called Khawarij, many of them, even into the 19th century, were still calling themselves a branch of the Khawarij. So this is but in the era of pan-Islamic unity, one wants not to be associated with a name that has come to be thought of in terms of radicalism. But from the very start, there were radical Khawarij, but there were also many moderate Khawarij. And what we mean by that, sorry?
Oh, I just wanted to add, I've read, yes, from modern Ibadi scholars, that what some have deemed or called the Kharijite succession in 37 Hijri or 657 Common Era, in reality should be called the Muhakkama succession and not the Khadrijites. And they based that on a tradition where, or I guess the tradition where the Khadrijites, Nafi bin al-Azraq and Abdullah bin al-Safar, broke away from the moderate Muhakkama, which would have been the proto-Ibadis, Abdullah ibn Ibad. Or if you're familiar with that tradition, I think you mentioned
I'm very familiar with it, yes, but it's somewhat problematic. I mean, actually here we have this, this is the traditional Ibadi narrative, that the Muhakkama, who were all, you know, and you're right, that the Ibadis would rather reuse this term Muhakkama. The problem is that this is not a term that's known to anybody outside Ibadi studies, basically, you know. So if you want to use language that is meaningful to other people, it becomes problematic. Nonetheless, that's fine. It is true, though, that the Ibadis say that the Muhakkama were sort of united until the year 684, when they went to visit a rebel, or sort of anti-caliph, or a rebel in Mecca, and then afterwards they split into three different groups, and you mentioned them: the Azariqa, the Sufriya, and the Ibadiyya. The truth is that we know nothing about this, and this is a legend, and whether this was a split of the more radical from the more moderate, or the other way around, is questionable. One thing that's rather interesting about this legend is that all of these names are based on colors. Azraq is blue in Arabic. Asfar is yellow. Abyad is white. And so, are these real people? There are even different accounts of who was the founder of the Sufriya. John Wilkinson, a major scholar of Oxford, who's written a lot about the origins of Ibadism, believes that there was no real difference between the Sufriya and the Ibadiyya in doctrine, but they were different in terms of their tribal base. So there's lots of different opinions on this. The whole question of who the Ibadiyya are, even, you know, what it's supposedly named after Abdullah ibn Ibad, but we have absolutely no sound historical information on who this Ibn Ibad was. We have, there is, you know, so many Ibadis say that it was a very famous person of the generation known as the successors, not the companions of the.
If you don't mind just clearing up one thing, because this is something that I hear a lot. Ibadis are often charged with being the followers of Abdullah ibn Ibad, obviously where we get the name
That's
from.
not a charge. Is that a charge? No, it's just that's what they trace their own history to this. This is the source of the name.
I mean, I guess when I tell people today that, hey, I'm an Ibadi, or I talk to other people about it, they say, oh, well, they're not followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They are followers of a man named Abdullah ibn Ibad. And so I guess you kind of answered a lot of what I was going to ask next. What is the significance of Abdullah ibn Ibad to Ibadism? You know, did he write any books, treaties, any opinions in jurisprudence?
We do have some correspondence that is attributed to Abdullah ibn Ibad, but in reality, we know absolutely nothing about him. And so he is said to have been a contemporary of Jabir ibn Zayd, right? I mean, if he was with this group in 684 and also corresponded with Jabir ibn Zayd, who is said to have been the organizer of the group in Basra. And again, I'd have to say that's an Ibadi point of view, because, you know, Wilkinson says, well, if Jabir ibn Zayd can be called an Ibadi, he'd have to be called a proto-Ibadi. There was no recognized group called the Ibadiyya at that time. But of course, the Sunnis claim Jabir ibn Zayd also as one of theirs. And so whether he was Ibadi is even a matter of dispute. So I'm not going to be able to clear up any of that. But of course, to say that the Ibadis don't follow the Prophet, they follow Abdullah ibn Ibad is absurd, because if you look into the Muslim works, in which they divide all the different groups, Islamic groups. They all have names based on who supposedly originated that group. They all do. So it doesn't, I mean, not the Sunni and Shi'a so much, but if you look at any of the subcategories, I mean, who are the Asharis, a major school of theology in Sunni Islam? They're followers of Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. You know, who are the Maturidis? They're followers of al-Maturidi. So we have to, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. So we have to recognize that all of them have names like this. So it's not a really good argument. It's not a good argument at all. It's very ridiculous. So if we ask, you know, who are the Ibadis today, you know, as I said, the one state in which has a significant number of Ibadis, possibly the majority of the Muslims in the country, is the Sultanate of Oman. We also have, now the thing is that even though Ibadism began in southern Iraq in the 8th century, they were persecuted, pushed out to the geographical margins, and through persecution and subsequent conquests, their numbers diminished, but they have survived certainly in Oman and in very small pockets in North Africa, specifically the Mazab Valley in Algeria, and the Nafusa Mountains of northwestern Libya. Here we have Jebel Nafusa here on the map, and the island of Jerba in Tunisia. Now those are teensy little areas, and the Ibadis used to cover much more of North Africa. And then on the Swahili coast, because of centuries of Omani settlement, there are Ibadis on the Swahili coast, especially the islands of Zanzibar and Pemba. So that's what I would say is some of the, you know, things about, you know, where the Ibadis are.
I would like to add that there is a growing Ibadi community in Ghana. I don't want to say oddly enough, but yeah, there is a growing.
In where? In Ghana?
Yeah, in Ghana.
In West Africa.
In West Africa. And actually, Abdul Rahman al-Salimi mentioned that in his book on Ibadism in Mesopotamia, that there's a growing Ibadi community in Ghana.
Perhaps there used to be an Ibadi community in Ghana. I don't think there is anymore. I think that
maybe the numbers aren't as substantial as I'm probably making it seem, but I'm guessing they're there from what, and I'm familiar with some people there as well who, but then again, the numbers, who knows? I just know that some of them exist there as well.
Really? Okay. Because certainly the Ibadis of North Africa used to trade with the kingdoms of West Africa. And so there was...
Modern, I think this might be a modern thing, just a push. Maybe that's something for you to look into. I've only about it and been aware of it through passing. And I have some friends who are Guyanese, who are Ghanaian, who are Ibadi. Sorry, I didn't mean to add that in.
Okay, no, thank you. I'd be very interested to know more about that.
Okay, so this is where you've shown where Ibadi communities exist today in modern times. But where have they existed? Again, like I mentioned, I read a book on Ibadi in Mesopotamia, even as far as India, Khorasan. You have shown East Africa, but I'm aware that they were more how do I want to put this? North Africa was a very huge Ibadi hub, if I explained that correctly.
It was, and
or a Khawarij hub as well. Other Khawarij.
Yes,
groups.
There were other Khariji states as well. No, you're right, and I didn't include slides pertaining to that here, but you are right that certainly the most famous Ibadi state, of course, in the only one that was really a state in North Africa was the Rustamid Empire, which was founded, in the late 700s and lasted until it was destroyed by the Fatimids in 909. But that was the last Ibadi state. Now, there were others, though. There were Sufris as well. And there were larger Ibadi communities. And the historians of, medieval North Africa have documented the gradual contraction of Ibadi settlements, so that there are many areas that used to be Ibadi that are no longer Ibadi. So yes, you're right.
And I would like to add that I read an article that Ibadis played a part in the conquest of Sicily, and there were Ibadi communities in Sicily, Italy once upon a time.
That may be. I don't know anything specifically about that.
Okay, all right. That might have been a stretch from the scholar who wrote that article, but I just wanted to ask if there was any credence behind it. So, distinctive features of Ibadism. In the realm of theology, what are some, and I know in jurisprudence, the differences are a lot less between Ibadism and Sunnism or Islam, but I know in theology, there are some very distinctive features that Ibadism have apart from Sunnism. So what are those distinguishing or distinctive features?
Okay, I'd be happy to share that. And let's see if I can get back to this then. Okay, so the, okay, there we go. So, the first one is sort of similar to something I said before, that performing religious obligations and avoiding what is prohibited, these are considered essential parts of faith. You do not have faith, you should not be called a believer or a Muslim if you're not doing this. At least that's in the tradition. So in classical Ibadism, only pious Ibadis were called Muslims or believers. So if you were a gravely sinning Ibadi who refused to repent, you should no longer be called a Muslim or a believer. And if you were not an Ibadi, your errors in practice and doctrine were such that you would not be called by an Ibadi a Muslim or a believer. However, that doesn't mean there was this totally radical contrast that you might consider, because Ibadis rejected the radical Khariji characterization of those outside their group as unbelievers whose blood may be shed. So instead, they, whereas we tend to translate kufr as unbelief, I translate it as infidelity in my book, because from an Ibadi perspective, there's more than one type of kufr. So rank unbelief would be kufr shirk, would be the unbelief of polytheism, whereas non-Ibadi Muslims or sinning Ibadis could only be called hypocrites or kuffar ni'mah, unfaithful ingrates, those who are ungrateful for God's blessings. And so there is this, middle kind of position between being a believer and being an unbeliever. And
the status of sinning Muslims. That's one distinctive feature. The status
yes. Okay. The status of a sinning Muslim is that a sinning Muslim would be either a hypocrite or a kafir ni'mah. Unless, we're talking about grave sinners who refuse to repent. Everybody sins, right? We all recognize that. But and so one of the core beliefs of Ibadism is the importance of affiliating with the in-group and dissociating from the out-group, okay? So there's a lot of discussion about this. And this is something, of course, that other groups also have, like the Shi'a also often emphasize this, and Salafis tend to emphasize this as well. But this was, whole books have been written on the topic of affiliation and dissociation.
And I believe Ibadi said that they've written the most on this, or they might have written the most on this subject. And I would like to add one thing I found very interesting about this concept that they have of walaya and bara'a is that it is very different than it is different than the Salafi understanding of it in the way it functions. Because as you've mentioned in lectures, you would think this concept, and then the way you see, you would think something totally different than what you get from Ibadis today.
Well, I agree with you, of course, because the big difference is that the Salafis would call anyone who doesn't belong to the group as unbelievers, and they should be killed if necessary or whatever. But from the Ibadi point of view, all who profess Islam, not whether they're Ibadi or not, they all belong to the Ummah of Muhammad. They're all monotheists, and they have all the rights of those who may properly be called Muslims. Ibadis can marry, have mutual inheritance from, have basically full relations. In fact, one very important early Ibadi theologian, his best friend and business partner was the most important Shia theologian of his day. Theologically, they were very far apart, but that didn't actually, if we are to believe al-Mas'udi, the historian, he said they were inseparable. They were always together. And so, no, you're absolutely right. It is quite different. It's not a matter of dehumanizing those who are outside of the group.
Separating yourself from people outside your group. It seems more like a religious disassociation.
It is.
At a level of cognizance rather than any actual practice in society.
That is certainly true today. I think in the early period, sometimes dissociation could be a kind of form of excommunication by the leader of the community of those who were considered dissenters or not following the true version. But obviously in more complex societies, it doesn't operate that way at all. And so in fact, I wrote a paper where I looked at different discussions of association and dissociation across time and found
from the 10th to the 21st century.
Yeah, right. And found that, the creed, for example, that I translated in my book, The Essentials of Ibadi Islam, which was written in 1925 in Zanzibar, was written by someone who was in constant contact with non-Ibadis. Even Ibadis in Zanzibar were a minority, and so they were at constant relationships with non-Ibadis. And he defined, and in his text, he writes it in the form of a dialogue between a teacher and a student. And the student says, what if a non-Ibadi is really nice to me and I start feeling affection for this person? The teacher said, that's not a problem. The Prophet was polite to everyone, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, as long as it doesn't reach the point of religious association where you don't recognize the distinction. So yes, you're absolutely right. And Ibadis, nobody who deals with Ibadis today would have any notion of being dissociated from. Seriously, they are some of the most polite and welcoming people. So yes, I do want to make sure that that people are aware of that. So fair enough, very good. So another theological difference is regarding the afterlife. Ibadis, whereas Sunni Muslims say that the Prophet will intercede on the last day for grave sinners, and by virtue of his intercession, sinners will be removed from hellfire and brought into paradise. Ibadis say no, the Prophet will not intercede for grave sinners. He will intercede for believers, but he will not intercede for grave sinners, and no one can leave hellfire for paradise. So sinners who are in hellfire will reside there for eternity. So that is a major distinction. Another major distinction in Ibadi tradition, although it doesn't have so much relevance today, is the imperative of establishing an Islamic state ruled by a righteous imam. Okay, so that there is this idea that this really goes to the heart of the origins of Ibadism. And so the system has often been called kind of proto-democracy, if you like. The imam should be selected through consultation of the leading scholars and leading men of the community, and he should be selected for his righteousness and his knowledge without regard to his lineage or ethnicity. So this is distinct from the Sunni Muslims who came, at least in theory, acknowledged only members of Quraysh as the caliph, and it's certainly distinct from the Shia, who acknowledged only Ali and his descendants as potential imams. But they also felt the imam is not, considered to be inviolate. If a ruler becomes tyrannical, one should try to overthrow him. If there are 40 men willing to exchange their lives for paradises, then they should try to overthrow a tyrant. And so, and the imam must consult religious scholars and rule righteously, or be regarded as, illegitimate. Another thing which I found interesting is that we often, because of the dominance of Wahhabism in today's world, we tend to think that if people are very puritanical regarding the law, then they're not going to be intellectual with regard to theology. And that is really different from Ibadism. In Ibadism, they're very zealous about matters of the law, but and they also believe that in matters of the law, we can only know right from wrong through a prophetic revelation. But in matters of theology, which means, how we understand God, they believe that the human intellect can know things about God. We can't know everything, but we can know things about God even without a prophetic revelation. So their texts use the usual, Islamic rationalist thing. What if a person lives all alone on an island, has no exposure to a prophet or his message? Is he still obligated to know that there is one God? And the answer is yes, he is. And so because of the rationalism in theology, they also say that any anthropomorphic descriptions of God, meaning descriptions of God that make God similar to human beings, the phrases that talk about God's eyes, his hands, and the hadiths that talk about, God putting his foot in hellfire. None of this can be taken literally because God does not have a body. So therefore, they are metaphors for that can mean something else. So if God's hand can mean his power or his generosity, depending on the context. His face is his presence, this sort of thing.
And the greatest difference, or what I understand to be the greatest difference between Ibadism and Sunnism, is the vision of God in the afterlife.
Yep, there you go. God will not be seen in the afterlife because God is not a body, does not have a body, and there can be no ocular vision of God in the afterlife. And yes, Sunnis, of course, if anyone is familiar with the history of Islamic theology, knows that the early school, the Mu'tazila, were highly rationalist, and in many ways Ibadi discussions on this are similar to Mu'tazili discussions. Whereas, and the Mu'tazila, which really, was a school that was formed before there was a group that was really called, this is the Sunnah, but eventually what became Sunni Islam, they kind of adopted aspects of rationalism, but also accepted there are things that are beyond the intellect. So, for example, they would say, God is sitting on a throne. We must believe it and accept it without trying to figure out how it can be so. Because they would say God is not a body. So if he's not a body, how can he be in one place to the exclusion of another? How can he be sitting on a throne? Likewise, with regard to the vision of God in the afterlife, they would say, we have to believe in it, even if we don't know how it will be. And they came up with different ideas as to how it might be and how to make it rationally acceptable. But yes, this is one of the differences. Exactly. And so in general, then, on the question of God's attributes and essence, and on the question of whether the Quran is a created communication from God, or is it an eternal word of God, Ibadi theology is similar to the Mu'tazila in saying that God's attributes really are not real things that exist in the essence. They are, because that would involve composition in God. And the Quran is simply a created expression of God's speech. It's not identical to God's eternal ability to speak. And so in this way, Ibadis are similar to the Mu'tazila. But on the question of free will versus predestination, Ibadi theology is similar to the Ash'ari school of Sunni Islam. And rather than the Ibadis imitating the Ash'aris, one of my former professors, Wilfred Madelung, wrote that really it was the Ibadis who first came up with this whole idea that God creates human acts, humans acquire them. And that al-Ash'ari really took the Ibadi idea, but it has come to be associated with the Ash'ari school. And so, whereas the Mu'tazila upheld free will, the Ibadis go much more toward predestination, like the Ash'aris. So this is sort of a brief summary of the most important distinctive features of Ibadism.
And the last thing about the distinctive features, all of those put together challenge long-held assumptions about binary oppositions, such as the createdness of the Quran and predestination are two things that theoretically can't be. How do Ibadis work these things out?
Wow, that's a good question. So to explain what you were saying, because I think if this is new to someone, this might seem very strange. Here's the issue. If God is the creator of human acts, and the Ibadis say he is, then he is the creator of your speech and my speech. So therefore, it has been argued that the Sunnis said the Quran is God's eternal speech, therefore it's not created, in order to make a clear distinction between the speech of God and human speech. But really, this is an insight of a particular scholar, William Montgomery Watt, the late great scholar of Edinburgh. And he's the one who said perhaps it was inevitable that the Sunnis who upheld God's creation of human acts would therefore have to say the Quran is not created. How is it that Ibadis, reconcile this? I don't think it has been recognized as an issue, because it is still a direct expression of something directly from God. Whereas when God creates a human act, it is an act that's linked to human will. God gives us choice, right? And so, it is, why is it that when God creates a human act and that act is evil, why is God not evil? Because God is simply empowering an act that we choose. That's why. Whereas, and therefore the Quran is a direct expression of God's speech. But it's created, it's in Arabic, it's in a language. And the Ibadis would say, that if it's created in Hebrew, it's the Torah, right? If it's created in Greek, it's the Injil. If it's created in Arabic, it's the Quran. But they would see that as being very different from God creating a human speech which is not expressive of God's will in the same way.
Okay. It's a bit of brain wrestling to get through that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look more into that in order to understand, because I did find that to be the most interesting thing about how some of these theories theoretically can't be together, but Ibadis managed to work it out. Right. So now on to your book, The Essentials of Ibadi Islam, which came out in 2012. It's primarily on, it's on Ibadi theology, of course, primarily based on the translation of a 19th century theological primer titled Al-Aqidah al-Wahbiyya by Nasser al-Rawadi Rawahi.
Rawahi, yeah. Mhm.
Born 1860, died 1920, also known as Abu Muslim al-Baghlani. And I wish I had known him before, because I knew of Abu Muslim al-Baghlani, but I didn't know that was the same person whose work you translated. And to a lesser extent, you translated another work on the discussion on the relationship between God's power and human acts by Abdulaziz al-Thamimi.
Correct.
Most of your research for the book was conducted in Oman during 2000 to 2001 academic year, with you returning to Oman in 2010 to do follow-up research for 2 months in February and March. I don't want to ask what took so long for the publication to come out, but tell me a little bit about all that went into the coming together of your project.
Yes. Well, originally, when I realized that there was nothing in English about Ibadism that was accessible to a non-specialist, to just try to understand what are the basic things, I thought, well, maybe I should write a book about Ibadism. And then when I realized that, I read something, it really struck me, and Ibad, the author in Oman, who wrote, we read everyone else's works, nobody reads ours. And I thought perhaps the best thing to do then would be to translate something. So why did it take so long? That's a good question, actually. It took so long because I was very, very busy teaching. And I know that a lot of people who don't understand academia have absolutely no idea how much time it takes to be a teacher, but it takes a huge amount of time. And also, translation is incredibly difficult. I think if I had just written a summary of Ibadism, it would have been much easier to be quick about it. But translation, to try to convey both accuracy and readability in English, is very, very difficult. So I found that basically I had to go over each paragraph about 5 times, so it took a very long time. And I was also using several different manuscripts of the Rawahi text. And so I was comparing the different manuscripts and differences between them. So my original idea was actually I was going to be publishing an edited version of the Arabic as well as the English translation. I ended up not doing that because I wanted to be able to make the English translation affordable for use as like a college textbook or graduate school textbook, where one would compare.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. Before to
no, quite all right. But unfortunately, Syracuse University Press didn't even allow me to put in the diacritical marks that the Arabists use to distinguish the different consonants. So like Arabic has, a dod and a dal, and those would be, in English, we would write the dod as a D with a dot under it, and the dal as just a D. That's just one example. They did not allow me to do that. I had originally submitted it with all the diacritics. And so I think that that's very unfortunate. However, I am grateful that they have made this available. And so, yeah, that's the reason that I included the text by Thamini, who is a very important Algerian scholar, died in the early 19th century. Was because it seems that Rawahi died before completing the creed that he wrote, and he did not really discuss the question of God's creation of human acts. And I thought, well, that's a huge issue. It may be that he didn't discuss it so much because this is an area in which the Ibadis agreed with the Sunnis, and so it wasn't as critical for his students to be as informed about it as it was to be informed about things on which they differed.
Okay. I do have some questions about the men whose works you translated. First, we'll start with al-Rawahi. Can you tell us a bit about his life and background? I found out recently that according to UNESCO, he is a major influence on a global scale. yeah, that he was admitted as a global influential person to UNESCO. I thought that was really interesting.
That's great. I didn't even know UNESCO had that kind of category, but I'm glad to hear that he's on it. Yes, and I called him Nasser al-Rawahi because that's the way he identified himself in the work, and the manuscripts identified him that way. In Oman, he's much better known as the poet Abu Muslim al-Baghlani. And actually, I need to correct myself. I realized I said he wrote the text in 1925. You reminded me he died in 1920. I was mixing him up with another scholar who died in 1925. But yeah, you are right. So he wrote it in 1920, not 1925. But so his father had been an important, he'd been a religious scholar in Oman and a judge in Oman during a time when there was an imam, an Ibadi Imam, following a movement that had actually overthrown the Sultan of Oman. And then they migrated to Zanzibar. Many people migrated from the interior of Oman to Zanzibar in the latter half of the 19th century for economic reasons. And so Abu Muslim became it's actually an Algerian Ibadi scholar, I believe, who called him the poet of the Arabs, and Omanis have really seized on that title for him. He's a great mystical poet. I mean, much of his poetry is very mystical in orientation. But he was also, of course, a full-fledged scholar. He was a judge, an Ibadi judge in Zanzibar. And he was also a journalist. He co-founded the first Arabic newspaper in Zanzibar, which was very anti-colonial. And he co-founded it in 1911. So, this is he is a very interesting person because he was living in a very cosmopolitan place at a time of growing contacts with Muslim reformers in Egypt in particular. And at the same time, he really wanted an Ibadi imamate in Oman. The imam his father had worked for was overthrown only a few years after, a little more than 2 years after he'd come to power. And there was another imamate uprising in 1913, which managed to conquer the interior of Oman, but not the coast. And Abu Muslim regarded himself as the poet of that movement, even though he was in Zanzibar and not in Oman. He was really kept in close tabs with Oman, but he was. It's possible that he was actually prevented by the British from leaving. He was considered something of a troublemaker. He was apparently had anti-British sentiment, which is hardly surprising, but I guess he wasn't as, amenable to being co-opted by the British as some of the other scholars were.
I wonder how widely circulated was his book after it had come out, because in your book you had mentioned it's not that well known amongst Ibadis today, and from all of the works you went through from the Grand Mufti of Oman, he only made reference to it once. So I was just wondering, in the time that it came out, was it widely circulated? And why did you choose to translate this work out of any other works that you may have had available? If not, or I was just wondering what was the thought process behind that?
Well, that's a good question. And I guess, certainly at that time, my knowledge of the breadth of Ibadi literature was not, at all comprehensive, and still isn't. But I was looking for something that would be brief. And because this was meant to be brief, although I would have to say, I've read multi-volume works that claim to aim at brevity too, written by Ibadi Muslims, so it's not necessarily guaranteed, but it was relatively brief. Now, I found out later that it had been published, but I have not found any of those published versions until the one that was published later, and I can't remember what year. but it was close to the time that my own book came out. It was issued in Oman, in Muscat, and that version seems to be much more available than the earlier versions. So, yeah. So, I mean, I know Abdurrahman As-Salami asked if I could also translate Nuruddin As-Salami's book, Masharik al-Anwar. And I think that would be a very worthy book to translate as a comprehensive theological source by a very well-known scholar. And it's got a lot more circulation, but yeah, it's not a project I am engaging in yet. Let's just say that.
Well, with Abu Muslim al-Baghlani being admitted into the UNESCO People of Global Influence, maybe his work will circulate a little bit more than what it has, even though I think it's only been 2 years since they admitted him. So, give it some time. But okay. Sorry, I got a little bit confused. Do we know the intentions behind al-Rawahi's writing al-Wahhabiyya? I mean, for reasons other than previous works on Ibadi doctrine, such as Kitab al-Istiqama being too long, complicated, difficult, and repetitive. I ask that because I find parts of his work have a bit of a sectarian feel to it, and I find that hard. And I find that hard to reconcile with the fact that he was for pan-Islamism and supported the ideas of Muhammad Abdu. And he spent most of his life in a cosmopolitan environment of Zanzibar. So I was just wondering, were Ibadis converting out of Ibadism and he was a primer in order to kind of bring them back or to solidify their faith? Because I know that was a problem early on in Zanzibar.
Well, this was a big problem in his lifetime, Ibadis converting to Sunni Islam. And I don't think his book was primarily to keep people from converting. It was meant as, a primer for beginning students. I think what beginning theology students, sort of at the level that, we might think of as high school or early college, something like that. And so it is meant, it follows the same order of topics and categories as other works, other creeds. Now, there have been other works that have been written specifically to try to convince Ibadis not to convert to Sunni Islam. I don't see his work as aimed primarily at that. I see it as just meant to be a textbook, a somewhat, simplifying textbook, although, a friend of my husband bought the book and started reading and said, oh my goodness, this is really dense, because certainly in the US, we are not used to thinking in terms of God's essence and attributes and all those questions pertaining to that. So I wouldn't call it easy, but at the same time, it certainly is a sound introduction to the topic. And in many ways, it's not that different from Sunni creeds as well. It's really not.
Except for I haven't come across any Sunni creed books where it had the teacher-student dialogue. I'm pretty sure they exist. Yeah. That was very an interesting feature of your book.
I agree. Yeah, it's not, in a way, it's interesting because that is a feature of many earlier Islamic texts, but not so much of more recent ones. And this is one of the things that's been interesting about researching the Ibadis at this time. But I think, to address your question about how does one reconcile the fact that he was an ardent Ibadi, but also wanted to promote pan-Islamic sentiments. Well, I think that this is a question that Ibadis today still are groping with, because for various political reasons in particular, one wishes to promote the unity of Muslims. And of course, at that time, in the early 20th century, with European colonialism such a huge problem, it was deemed really essential that Muslims unite in order to that there, if you have a more immediate enemy, you're not going to focus as much on differences between different Muslim groups. And I think it's quite clear that, the Ibadis and the Ibadi judges and the Sunni judges sat together on the bench. It's not like they were even separated in his time. So they would have constant interactions, and certainly they would see the Sunnis as a rival, especially since many Ibadis were converting to Sunnism. But at the same time, I think, we as human beings were complicated. We have many different identities, right? And so my husband is a psychologist, and he explained it once in terms of levels of the mind, and which is the level of the mind, or I would say, which identity are you going to call forth as the primary identity you're going to be operationalizing at that moment. If you're involved in sectarian polemics, then Ibadism is going to be your main identity. But if you're involved in anti-colonial activism, then Islam is going to be the basis of your identity. And so, my husband put it in a way that I really liked. He said, because he's something of an artist, and he says, as an artist, sometimes I find the behavior of people at a football game to be really gross and distasteful. But at other times, I may attend a football game, in which case I'm part of that crowd. And I really like that analogy, because there is something to that. We are complex. We don't just wear one hat.
I totally agree. And this reminds me of a conversation I was having with some friends of mine, with some friends of mine about, I guess, being a Muslim myself, and then also being a Black American. The topic comes up, which one comes first? I know British Muslims placed in their lap as well. Are you British first or Muslim first? But it's like, I don't see a competition between these identities. I wear one hat in certain situations, and I wear the other in other situations, and I've never been in a position conflicted with each other.
Right.
So definitely sympathize with what you just said, that, there are different hats and humans are complicated in that sense.
Indeed.
All right, so the other author whose work you translated, Abdulaziz Al-Tamimi, which is a very interesting character, individual who was born 1718, died 1808. His work on God's power and human acts. It was from what I found to be very interesting. It's from his efforts and that of his teacher, Abu Zakaria Yahya bin Salih al-Afdali, who died 1787. It's from their efforts that the modern Ibadi Renaissance in Algeria was spearheaded in the 18th centuries. Can you tell us a little bit about what the modern Ibadi Renaissance was about in Algeria, and did it spill over? Did it have far-reaching effects to other Ibadi communities outside of Algeria?
Well, this whole term, the modern Ibadi Renaissance, this is a term that John Wilkinson came up with to talk about sort of the revival of scholarship that took place beginning in Algeria, but sort of simultaneously in Oman with the scholar Abu Nabhan. And so because they are sort of coterminous and didn't immediately impact each other, but then with the increase in technological improvements for transportation and new forms of communication, certainly in the course of the 19th century, they ended up being much more in contact with each other. But there have always been linkages between North Africa and Oman. I'm thinking about when the imamate was revived in Oman in the 17th century, in 1624, and some scholar from Jerb in Tunisia heard about it and came to Oman to see what was going on and said, well, this is great, but you really should establish some schools too, And so I think that, so I don't mean to say that they were totally separated, but nonetheless, they each sort of did develop something of their own literature. And it's only, I would say, relatively recently that there's been this instantaneous contact between the two regions. So Famini, of course, the selection I have is from his theological work, Ma'alim ad-Din, but he also was the author of a huge and very, very important legal compendium called Kitab al-Nil. And, it's interesting, he called it Kitab al-Nil. He actually spent time at an Ibadi, like an Ibadi agent, sort of the Arabic term would be a warsha, like an agency, an outpost in Cairo. And so, but that work, and then the Algerian scholar Mohammed bin Yusuf Atfesh's commentary on that work really became the foundation of a new focus on wanting to really revive Ibadi scholarship and etc. Ibadi scholarship had never died, so I'm not sure you can really say here it begins here, But
is that Ibadis started reading more Sunni literature. I think you mentioned his last name Naban from Oman. I can remember the.
Oh yeah, Abu Nabhan.
And Umar Ibrahim Bayud.
Bayud, yes, you're right. Yes. So really, the American scholar in Morocco, Paul Love, has really traced this more because he has done work specifically on the circulation of Ibadi manuscripts. And so he has found, he's sort of traced at which point Ibadi scholars really started reading more Sunni texts. And it was well before, what we would call the modern period. It was more, the late medieval period. But certainly, what is different about the 19th and 20th centuries, and of course it continues today, is that, with the increasing globalization of society, people are simply reading each other's works a whole lot more, and people do have an awareness of it. And so, yes, Abu Nabhan, the great scholar whom Wilkinson calls the father of the modern Ibadi Renaissance in Oman, was very, studied all the different books of the different sects. I mean, the Shia as well as the Sunnis, and insisted on faithfully quoting them, which is quite interesting. His son Nasser migrated to Zanzibar, was actually taken there by the Sultan of Oman, and he, he wrote this huge multi-volume work, which was meant to be actually a defense of Ibadism against Sunni Islam. And in that work, he has entire Sunni books that he quotes, verbatim, and then analyzes sentence by sentence as to, well, this is found, here we disagree, and this is why. So there certainly was, and he died in 1846. So therefore, yes, we have, a great deal of interaction with the Sunni intellectual tradition too. Yeah.
And the reason why I wanted to talk about this aspect of Ibadi history in the modern period is because you see a more reconciliatory approach towards other schools. And I was just curious because Omanis, and I don't know if it's in other Ibadi communities, are known for a high level of tolerance of people who are different from them. So I was wondering, is it in this period during the Ibadi Renaissance, the Ibadi Reformation, that these things start to transpire? Or was it something later than that? Or did these things just always exist in the Ibadi community?
Boy, that's in a way, it's a difficult question to answer. I would have to say, to some extent, they've always been very tolerant. For example, the Hindu community in Muscat has been there for centuries. And, so they were not by any means persecuted or, as unbelievers or anything like that. So yes, I think that on a practical level, Ibadis have always been very tolerant of other groups and outsiders. Obviously, in the contemporary Muslim world, Ibadis are a very tiny minority and they're on the defensive. They're often attacked by Sunnis in particular, right? Especially Salafis or, people of Wahhabi kind of orientation. They're often attacked as unbelievers. The former Mufti of Saudi Arabia, bin Baz, for example, very publicly attacked the Ibadis as unbelievers because they denied the vision of God in the afterlife, and they denied the Prophet's intercession for grave sinners, and they believed in the creation of the Quran. Those were the three main points, and that, of course, led the Mufti of Oman to have to defend Ibadism. So on the one hand, Ibadis feel that their own intellectual tradition, every group feels that their own intellectual tradition is superior to others, right? So they want to defend it, but at the same time, it's very important for them socially and politically to emphasize commonalities, right, with other groups. So the little tiny communities in North Africa, for example, they were they would join with Sunni Muslims against colonialism and in being part of the state and all of this. Of course, it's in Libya, Gaddafi was very anti-Ibadi, really tried to systematically destroy the Berber language, and the literature, executed scholars. Really, that's really the worst. In Algeria, I was really surprised. I finally got to visit the Mizab Valley for the first time last year.
The architecture of the buildings,
yes,
it looks really nice.
Oh, it's amazing. It's a wonderful place, and the people were wonderful there. And it's an isolated desert valley, though, so it's kind of interesting that it has a special atmosphere for sure. But more and more Sunnis who are employees of the state have been brought in to fill civil service positions. And I was really shocked to find out that in 2013, 2014, there were violent physical attacks on the Ibadis in some of the major towns of Wadi Mizab. And one leading Ibadi scholar just shrugged his shoulders. Oh yeah, every few years this happens. And, as I was trying to figure it out, reading articles about it, from the newspapers, it seemed to me that the state was trying to depict it as a conflict between Ibadis and Sunnis and that both sides are to blame. Whereas it seems to me, as far as I could tell, that it was really Sunni attacks against Ibadis, and any violence by Ibadis was in self-defense, as far as I can tell. And that it was stirred up sometimes for political reasons, but sometimes by Saudi preachers. Of course, with the internet, anything is possible. And, apparently there was some Saudi preacher who had said the Ibadis are unbelievers who should be killed, and it's the religious duty of Muslims to kill them, and that kind of thing. So, so that is, of course, quite shocking. In Tunisia, when I visited Jerba and also spoke with leading Ibadi scholars in Tunisia, they felt, of course, in much of the Arab world, the state is highly authoritarian. People don't really have, freedom, right? Intellectual freedom, or so often religious freedom as well. And so there has been, since the Arab Spring uprising in Tunisia, more freedom among Ibadis to celebrate their history, etc. But I think that, in both Algeria and in Tunisia, there is a recognition of the Ibadis as an important historical component and cultural component of the state. So In Oman, of course, the situation is different, and it has to do with, it's a very complex history, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but I would just, perhaps I'll share just a couple of things. I'll share my screen here. There we go. So, I'm not, in order to, I'm going to jump over a lot of history, but just to say that, the Oman is a sultanate. It has a ruler called a sultan, and the Al Busaid has ruled Oman since the very first one, Ahmed ibn Said, who came to power, depending on what year, there are different years that are given, but we'll just say the most conservative estimate could say 1753. And he was considered an Ibadi Imam, and his son also claimed to be an Imam, but after that, they didn't claim that title. And as I alluded to before, there were some uprisings, conservative Ibadi uprisings against the Sultanate in Oman. But in any case, without getting into all of that, I'll just say that Sultan Qaboos, who came to power in 1970 and stayed in power until he died in January 2020, really reoriented the Sultanate, not only modernized it a great deal, but he also forbade any sectarianism in the teachings of Islam. So in the mosques, in the schools, there is, the teaching is sort of more generic Islam. It's not specifically Ibadi. And there are significant Sunni and Shiite communities in Oman, and it would be, politically dangerous to agitate sectarian sentiments. So that has, therefore, it's only for those who specialize in theological studies who end up understanding the differences. And and he appointed as Mufti, as the highest interpreter of Islam in Oman, Sheikh Ahmed bin Hamad al-Khalili, who's been the Mufti since 1975. And the Mufti has certainly promoted the idea of Ibadism as a moderate branch of Islam, as a very tolerant branch of Islam. But he's also been very interested in promoting Ibadi views as very rational. He issued this huge, I don't know how many volumes have been published so far. I think maybe 14, something like that, of this.
15 out of 90 volumes or something?
That's a different thing. Okay. Right. That's a work that was written in the mid-19th century. But this is a recent publication. The first volume was issued in 2017, I think. And it's been, but in any case, Burhan al-Haq, which means demonstration of the truth. And each volume deals with a particular topic on which he really tries to engage in all of the rational argumentations for different Muslim points of view, and of course argues for the Ibadi point of view. So I think in some ways the Mufti really shows this balance between wanting to emphasize pan-Islamic unity as well as to argue for Ibadi views. And the Minister of Awqaf and Religious Affairs, who's the other sort of visible representation, if you like, of Islam in Oman, Abdullah ibn Muhammad al-Salami, doesn't engage in that type, in defense of Ibadism at all. On the contrary, his ministry has published a journal called Tafahum, which means mutual understanding, and has, published articles from a broad range of people of different backgrounds.
Ministry of Oman's website, and they have quite a few volumes in English.
Yes, they do. You are right. They've stopped publishing last year. The editor decided to stop publishing it. But another thing has been this roaming exhibit, and you see a flyer there for it, Tolerance, Understanding, Coexistence, Oman's Message of Islam. And so this is, Oman has really, in talking about tolerance, understanding, and coexistence, the Minister of Religious Affairs, Salami, is talking about this on a global scale. In fact, he published a book called Religious Tolerance, a vision for a new age, in which he is arguing that religious people of all religions share certain values in common that we can use to promote human rights and the good of all humankind, and to address climate change and things like this as well. And so, yes, so that perhaps can, I'll perhaps stop there. We can, because I know that one can go on forever in discussing these things, but yeah.
I know there's so many different aspects of the Ibadi Islam that one could research or read about. I've been collecting some of these studies on Ibadism in Oman books. I think there's like 17 volumes of it. Just looking through the chapters, it's like, I mean, there's just so much. There's just so much. And I think for somebody not familiar with Ibadi Islam, the names, the history, the theology, even jurisprudence can be a bit tedious in the beginning. But I hope to start something where I unpack a lot of these things for the average person like myself, because I've been getting a lot of questions since I've been in Ibadi Islam. So, but thank you, Professor Hoffman, for doing this for me. I greatly appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed the whole presentation, as well as the articles, and your book was phenomenal. If you have any closing remarks, anything you'd like to say to the audience, or where they can find your works, or any, I'll plug your publications in the description, but if there's anything.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Well, I would just want to thank you. And really, I would have to, if there are any of the Ibadis of Oman or Algeria or Tunisia who are watching this, I would just have to say, I have been given so much help and such warm welcome everywhere I've gone. And it's really been a beautiful thing. And I really do hope that people can come to understand better who the Ibadis are, and that we can promote this kind of universal vision that Sheikh Salami wishes to promote.
I believe the ground is fertile to do so. I think a lot of people are over the religious polemics and debating, endless brain wrestling over things that wouldn't any conclusion. It's more about, let's understand each other's position, where we're coming from, try to find commonalities and build upon that.
Exactly.
Right,
well, thank you very much.
And for you, it's still early. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
I'll be working on putting my kids to bed. So
indeed. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great evening then.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
I think you might have to hand the.
I handed it over to you. You are host.
Okay, so now I can end it. All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.